There are some games people play for fun. Others, you should never play at all. The midnight game isn't just a silly ritual you read about on the internet. It's real, and it's dangerous. At least, that's what I learned that night. This is the story of the night I made the worst decision of my life. The night I realized there are things in this world we shouldn't mess with. Things that don't play by our rules. I didn't believe in curses. Honestly, I didn't believe in much of anything. But all it takes is one moment, one bad decision, to change everything. That's what happened to me. If you ever hear about the midnight game, don't be like me. Don't try to prove it's just a story, because once you invite it in, there's no taking it back. I grew up in a small town where nothing ever really happened. You know the kind of place I mean. Quiet streets, barely any cars, and the sort of stillness that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world some nights. It was late fall, and the air had that chill to it, where every breath feels sharp. The leaves had mostly fallen, and the trees stood like skeletons against the sky. I was 17, and for my friends and me, finding ways to kill time was almost like a game in itself. We had a routine. After school, we'd meet up at Josh's house or mine and hang out until it got dark. Sometimes we'd watch movies, sometimes we'd just mess around online. But what we loved the most were urban legends. We were obsessed with them. Ghost stories, unexplained mysteries, anything that gave us that little rush of fear while we sat safe in a warm room. There were 4 of us that night: me, Josh, Lisa, and Mark. Josh was the ringleader. He had this way of making everything sound exciting, like he could sell you on just about anything if you gave him 5 minutes. Mark was his sidekick, always the first to jump on board with any crazy plan Josh came up with. Lisa, though, she was different. She wasn't shy, exactly, but she wasn't the kind of person who went looking for trouble either. She had this quiet way about her, like she was always thinking about something you couldn't quite figure out. And then there was me. I guess I was the skeptic. The one who always needed proof before I believed anything. Back then, I thought that made me smart. But looking back now, maybe I was just naive. It was a Friday night. My parents were out of town, and Josh came over with this wild look in his eyes. He said he'd found something on one of those creepy forums we liked to scroll through. "It's called the Midnight Game," he said, like it was some big discovery. Mark was sitting on the couch, and before Josh could even explain, he was already nodding, like, "Yeah, let's do it." Lisa was the only one who hesitated. "What's the midnight game?" I asked. Josh grinned and started laying it all out. "It was a ritual," he said. "You write your name on a piece of paper, put a drop of your own blood on it, light a candle, and knock on your front door 22 times, finishing on the stroke of midnight. Then you let the candle guide you through the dark for the next 3 hours." He said it was supposed to summon something, a presence, and that the goal was simple: don't let your candle go out. Lisa shook her head. "That sounds, I don't know, stupid," she said, but her voice wavered. I could tell it wasn't just skepticism. There was something else there, a nervousness. Josh, of course, laughed. "It's just a game," he said. "Nothing's going to happen," and that was all it took. Mark was in, Josh was in, and Lisa, well, she didn't want to be the only one to back out. And me, I went along because, honestly, I didn't think anything would happen either. It seemed harmless, a ritual, a candle, a piece of paper. What could go wrong? We spent the next hour getting everything ready. It felt almost ceremonial. Josh had printed out the instructions from the forum, and he read them out loud, step by step, like he was leading some kind of twisted scavenger hunt. "First, we need paper," he said. We found some blank sheets in the kitchen drawer. Each of us sat at the table, writing our full names carefully, like we were signing some kind of legal document. When it came time to prick our fingers, Lisa hesitated. "Do we really have to do this?" she asked, holding the safety pin Josh had grabbed from the sewing kit. "It's just a drop of blood," he said, already poking his finger and squeezing out a tiny red bead. Mark went next, making a show of how little it hurt. I followed, grimacing as the pin broke the skin. Lisa was last. She winced, muttering something under her breath as she pressed her finger against the paper. With our papers ready, Josh handed out the candles. They were these old, half-melted things he'd found in a drawer at his house. Mine was a pale yellow, with a wick that took 3 tries to light. Once all 4 candles were burning, we turned off the lights. The house went completely dark, except for the small, flickering glow of the flames. It was strange how different everything felt in that moment. Shadows danced across the walls, making the room feel bigger, emptier. The quiet became heavier, like the air had thickened. Lisa stood closest to the door, clutching her candle like it was the only thing keeping her safe. "I don't like this," she said softly, but Josh waved her off. "It's just a game," he said again, flashing that grin of his. "What, you scared already?" She didn't answer. She just stared at her candle, her lips pressed into a tight line. Mark, on the other hand, was eating it up. He was pacing back and forth, joking about what kind of presence we were supposed to summon. "Maybe it's a ghost," he said, wiggling his fingers like some cartoon villain. "Or maybe it's just the wind." His laughter echoed in the stillness, but it felt off, forced, like he was trying to convince himself as much as the rest of us. I didn't say much. I kept glancing at the clock on the wall, watching the seconds tick closer to midnight. I couldn't explain it, but something about this felt different from all the other dumb stuff we'd done. There was this chill in the air. Not cold, exactly, but sharp. It settled in my chest, making my breaths feel shallow. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. As the clock struck midnight, Josh stepped up to the front door. "All right," he said, holding his candle in one hand and the paper with his name in the other. "Here goes nothing." We all gathered behind him, our candles casting long shadows on the walls. He knocked. Once. Twice. The sound echoed through the house, louder than it should have been. By the 15th knock, the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on us. None of us said a word. When he finished the 22nd knock exactly on the stroke of midnight, we all held our breath. Nothing happened, at least, not right away. Josh turned around, grinning like he'd just won a bet. "See?" he said. "Told you it's just a stupid game." But then the wind picked up outside. It came out of nowhere, rattling the windows hard enough to make Lisa jump. Her candle flickered for a moment, the flame dipping dangerously low before steadying again. We all froze, staring at each other. Nobody said it, but we were all thinking the same thing. What if we'd made a mistake? For the first few minutes, nothing happened. It felt like any other night in my house. Quiet, still, a little boring. We started moving around, like the instructions said. Josh led the way, his candle held high as he wandered into the living room. Mark followed close behind, and Lisa and I stayed near the back. Our footsteps were the only sound, soft against the wooden floors. I tried to tell myself it was just a game, that we were wasting our time. But the darkness in the house felt deeper than usual. The flickering candlelight barely touched the corners of the rooms, leaving strange, shifting shapes in the shadows. Every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, even though I knew no one else was there. About 10 minutes in, I noticed something odd. There was a cold draft brushing past my arm, just enough to raise goosebumps. At first, I thought someone had left a window open, but when I checked, they were all shut tight. It didn't make sense. The air shouldn't have been moving at all. That's when I heard it. Faint, almost too soft to catch. A whisper, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I froze, straining to hear. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding us. I looked at Lisa, and her wide eyes told me she'd heard it too. "Did you?" I started, but Josh cut me off. "It's just your imagination," he said, his voice a little too loud, but the way he avoided looking at me told me he'd heard it too. We kept moving, but the atmosphere had shifted. The draft grew stronger, brushing past us in waves, and the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they were getting louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a rhythm to them, like a chant or a plea. Lisa clung to her candle like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her breathing was shallow, and I could see her hands trembling. Then it happened. Lisa's candle went out. 1 second the flame was there, and the next, it vanished, snuffed out by a gust of cold air that shouldn't have been there. She let out a small gasp and fumbled with her lighter, but her hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't strike a spark. "Lisa, relight it," I hissed, my voice sharper than I intended. The rules were clear. If your candle goes out, you have to relight it immediately, or, well, none of us wanted to find out what "or" meant. Josh and I stepped closer, shielding her with our bodies as she finally managed to get the flame going again. But something had changed. The air around us felt heavier, like we weren't alone anymore. That's when I noticed the shadows. At first, I thought it was just the flickering candlelight playing tricks on my eyes, but then I realized they were moving in ways that didn't match our movements. Stretching, bending, creeping along the walls like they had a mind of their own. One of them darted across the room, fast and deliberate, and I swear it was headed straight for Eliza before disappearing into the corner. "Did you see that?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Josh didn't answer. For the first time all night, he looked genuinely nervous. We all stood there, frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to happen. It started as a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just one of the shadows shifting again, but this time, it didn't fade away. I turned my head slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and that's when I saw it. A figure. Tall, impossibly tall, with a long, distorted silhouette that didn't match the shape of any human being. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were hollow. Black voids that seemed to pull in the flickering candlelight around them, swallowing it whole. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, but then it moved. A subtle, jerking motion, like it wasn't used to existing in our world. My whole body froze. My legs felt rooted to the floor, and my mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. All I could do was stare, my candle shaking in my hands. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full, heavy, like the air was holding its breath along with us. Even the whispers had stopped. It felt like the house itself was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. "Did you hear that?" Mark's voice broke the silence, sharp and panicked. He spun around, his candle casting wild, erratic shadows on the walls. "There's something behind me," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I turned to look, but there was nothing there, just the empty room and the faint sound of scratching, like fingernails dragging against wood. Before I could say anything, the doors slammed shut, all of them. The sound was deafening, echoing through the house like a gunshot. Lisa screamed, clutching her candle so tightly I thought it might break. Mark was still spinning in circles, his face pale and his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Then, one by one, the candles started going out. It wasn't the wind this time. There was no draft, no explanation. It was deliberate. The figure moved through the shadows, its long, spindly limbs stretching unnaturally as it crept closer. Each time it passed, another candle was snuffed out, leaving us with less and less light. First Mark's, then Lisa's. The darkness closed in around us, thick and suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Not us, me specifically. Like it knew something about me that I didn't. Like it was waiting for me to make a mistake, to let my guard down for even a second. My candle flickered violently, the flame shrinking down to almost nothing before flaring back to life. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Josh was yelling something, instructions maybe, or just panicked nonsense, but his voice barely registered. All I could focus on was the figure. It was closer now, so close I could see the way its form seemed to ripple, like smoke trapped in a human shape. It tilted its head, as if curious, and I swear I saw the corners of its hollow eyes twitch, like it was smiling without a mouth. The scratching sound came again, louder this time, like it was inside the walls, or under the floorboards. I couldn't tell anymore. My whole body was trembling, and I gripped my candle tighter, desperate to keep the flame alive. In that moment, I realized the rules weren't just guidelines. They were survival. And we were losing. Josh snapped. He wasn't the fearless leader anymore. He was just another kid in way over his head. "This is stupid," he shouted, his voice breaking as he bolted for the nearest light switch. "I'm done with this." He flicked it on. Nothing happened. The room stayed dark, the only light coming from the 3 remaining candles, mine, his, and Lisa's. Josh tried another switch, then another, each time with the same result. No power, no escape. The air shifted again, colder, heavier. The entity was closer now. I could feel it before I saw it. That oppressive weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Every time one of our candles flickered, it seemed to gain ground, moving with that strange, jerking motion through the shadows. It wasn't just stalking us anymore. It was hunting. I said, "Stick together," I said, my voice shaking but steady enough to cut through the panic. "We have to follow the rules. Keep your candles lit and keep moving." But Josh wasn't listening. He was pacing, muttering to himself, the flame of his candle wobbling dangerously as his hands trembled. I remembered something from the post Josh had shown us earlier, a comment buried deep in the thread, barely a sentence long. "If it gets too close, offer it something. Salt, metal, something valuable." It wasn't much, but it was all I had to go on. "Stay here," I whispered to Lisa, who was clutching her candle and standing frozen by the couch. "I'll be back." I moved through the house, keeping my candle close to my chest. The shadows were alive now, shifting and darting just out of reach. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a scream in the silence. In the kitchen, I grabbed the salt shaker and a handful of coins from the counter, stuffing them into my pocket. My heart was racing, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure looming behind me. When I got back to the living room, I knew something was wrong. Mark was gone. His candle had been snuffed out, the wax still warm where it had fallen to the floor. "Mark?" I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. No answer, just that awful, suffocating silence. He'd sacrificed himself to find me, and Mark had helped him. and no one else could understand why. We found his phone lying on the ground near the door. The screen cracked, as if he dropped it in a hurry. His backpack was still there too, untouched. It didn't make sense. He wouldn't have left without his stuff. But there was no sign of him. No footprints, no sound of the door opening or closing. Just nothing. "Where is he?" Lisa's voice was trembling, her eyes darting around the room. Josh didn't answer. He was staring into the corner, where the shadows seemed to be gathering, pooling into a shape that wasn't quite solid, but wasn't empty either. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "We can't stay here," I said. "We have to keep moving." The three of us stuck close together, but the house felt bigger now, like the walls were stretching and shifting around us. Every room we entered seemed darker than the last, the shadows deeper and more hostile. And no matter where we went, that sense of being watched never left. Mark was gone, and deep down I think we all knew we wouldn't see him again, but none of us were brave enough to say it out loud. It didn't matter where we went, it was always there, just out of sight, waiting. The shadows in the hallway seemed to ripple, stretching toward us like they had a purpose. The air was colder now, biting at my skin even though the windows were shut tight. My candle flickered violently with every step, and I gripped it so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't let it go out. I couldn't let it win. We ended up back in the living room, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The walls seemed closer, pressing in on us, and the darkness outside the reach of our candles was absolute. That's when I saw it, standing in the far corner, just beyond the glow of the flames. The figure was taller than I remembered, its limbs impossibly long, its hollow eyes locked on me. It wasn't just watching anymore. It was coming. When I backed up until my shoulder hit the wall, my candle trembling in my hands. "Why did you call me?" The voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from everywhere, deep and distorted, like the sound of wood groaning under pressure. The words sent a chill down my spine, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then I remembered the salt. My hand shot to my pocket, pulling out the shaker I'd grabbed from the kitchen. The comment from the post echoed in my mind. Salt. Metal. Something valuable. It was the only thing I had left. With shaking hands, I crouched down and poured the circle around me, careful not to let the candle tip or go out. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The entity moved closer, its form shifting and flickering like a bad signal. It stopped at the edge of the circle, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. It didn't cross. It couldn't. For a brief moment, I felt like I could breathe again. But the relief was short-lived. I wasn't the only one in danger. Lisa was next to me, her candle flickering dangerously low. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of terror and determination. She reached up to her neck, pulling off the small silver locket she always wore. It was her grandmother's, something she never took off. "I'm sorry," she whispered, holding it out toward the figure. Her voice was barely audible, but the words felt heavy, like they carried more weight than the room could handle. The entity hesitated, its form flickering again as it leaned toward her, the hollow voids where its eyes should have been narrowing. The locket seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight as Lisa placed it on the floor just outside the salt circle. For a moment, everything went still. The figure reached out, its long, spindly fingers brushing the silver. And then, it was gone. Just like that. The shadows snapped back into place and the house felt normal again. Almost. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. "Run," I said, grabbing Lisa's hand and pulling her toward the front door. Josh was already ahead of us, his candle shaking as he fumbled with the lock. The door wouldn't budge at first, like something was holding it shut, but then it burst open, and we spilled out into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the street, the house shrinking into the distance behind us. None of us said a word. What could we say? Mark was gone. The game was over. But whatever we'd let into that house, it wasn't done with us, not really. When the sun came up, I thought it would all feel like a bad dream. That's what I told myself as I sat in my room, staring at the first light creeping over the horizon. But it wasn't a dream, it was real. And Mark was still gone. Josh and I went back to the house later that morning. Lisa refused to come with us. She said she couldn't step foot in there again, not after what happened. When we walked inside, everything looked normal. Too normal. The salt circle I had poured was gone, the candles were nowhere to be found, and the house smelled like it had been freshly cleaned. If you didn't know any better, you'd think nothing had happened at all. But we knew better. We reported Mark as missing. We told the police everything, but of course, they didn't believe us. Why would they? Who would believe a story like this? They searched the house, questioned us, and even brought in search dogs, but they didn't find anything. No evidence, no trace of Mark. It was like he'd just vanished. I wish I could say it ended there, that we closed the door on that night and went back to our lives. But things haven't been the same since. Not for any of us. Sometimes late at night, I'll wake up at exactly 3 a.m. every time, without fail. And when I do, I hear whispers, faint, distorted, like they're coming from inside the walls. They say my name, they ask questions I don't want to answer, and every so often, when I turn on a light, it flickers for just a moment before coming on. I can't prove it's connected to the game, but deep down, I know it is. Can't imagine what it's like for... Lisa moved away a few months after that night. She said she needed a fresh start, but I think she was running from something. Josh won't talk about it at all. He acts like it never happened, but I've seen the way his hands shake when the lights go out. We've all changed in our own ways. The midnight game took something from us, and it left something behind. This isn't a warning to those who don't believe. I was one of you once. I thought I was smarter than the stories, that I could laugh in the face of the unknown and walk away untouched. I was wrong. If you ever hear about the midnight game, don't play it. Don't even think about it, because once you start, you're inviting something into your life, something that doesn't leave, something that watches, something that waits. Because once you start the game, you can never truly end it. Some games aren't meant to be played, and some doors aren't meant to be opened. We thought we were just messing around with an urban legend, but that night changed everything. It's not something I can ever forget, and it's not something I'd wish on anyone else. There are things out there we'll never fully understand, and maybe it's better that way. If you've ever experienced something you can't explain, something that left you questioning what's real, I want to hear about it. Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, or if it made you think twice about the things that go bump in the night, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means a lot, and it helps me keep sharing these stories with you. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and remember, not every game is worth the risk.